September 4th, 476 AD. A barbarian warlord named Odoacer walks into the palace in Ravenna, Italy. He finds a teenage boy sitting on the throne. The boy's name is Romulus Augustulus. He's 14 years old. He's been emperor for less than a year, and he's absolutely terrified. Odoacer doesn't kill him. He just tells him to leave. Take off the purple robes, hand over the crown, go live quietly somewhere. Your services are no longer needed. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire ends. No dramatic battle, no apocalyptic destruction, no cities burning, just a barbarian telling a scared kid that the empire is over, and the kid agreeing because what else can he do? The empire that had ruled the known world for over 1,000 years simply stopped existing. But here's what nobody tells you. That's not when things fell apart. That's not when civilization collapsed. That's not when the lights went out across Europe. The real story of what happened after Rome fell is way more complicated, way more interesting, and way less apocalyptic than you've been led to believe. For centuries, we've been told that the fall of Rome plunged Europe into the Dark Ages, that barbarians destroyed everything. That knowledge was lost, that civilization itself nearly died, that it took 1,000 years for Europe to recover, and almost all of that is wrong. Today, we're uncovering what really happened when the greatest empire in history collapsed. What did people experience? What was actually lost? What survived? And why does everything you learned in school about the Dark Ages need to be completely reconsidered? Let's find out what really happened when Rome fell. First, we need to understand what Rome actually was at its peak, because most people don't realize just how interconnected and advanced the Roman world had become. At its height around 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Persian Gulf. It controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea, which they literally called our sea. 50 to 70 million people lived under Roman rule. That was somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all humans alive at the time. All under one government, one legal system, one economy. Roads connected everything. Over 250,000 miles of roads, with 50,000 miles of that being paved highway that you could drive a car on today. You could travel from Britain to Syria and stay on Roman roads the entire way. Aqueducts brought fresh water to cities. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts delivering 300 gallons of water per person per day. That's more than many modern cities provide. Cities had running water, public baths, central heating systems, apartment buildings, shopping centers, public libraries, and entertainment venues that could hold 50,000 people. Trade networks spanned the known world. Silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain. If you had money in Rome, you could buy products from 3 continents. The economy was massive. Standardized currency worked everywhere. Banking systems allowed you to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another. International contracts were enforceable through Roman law. Latin was the common language from Britain to North Africa. A merchant from modern-day France could do business in modern-day Turkey without a translator. And technology was genuinely impressive. Romans had concrete that was stronger than modern concrete. We still don't know exactly how they made it. They had surgical tools that look frighteningly modern. They had mechanical water mills, central heating, and glass windows. This wasn't a primitive society. This was advanced civilization, and then it all came apart. But here's the thing. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't even happen in 1 century. The traditional date, 476 AD, is actually kind of arbitrary. Historians picked it because it's when the last Western emperor was deposed. But the empire had been fragmenting for over 200 years by that point. The 3rd century was chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, there were over 50 different emperors, most of whom were murdered. Civil wars were constant. The economy collapsed. Plague swept through. Barbarian invasions increased. The empire split into multiple pieces. For a while, there were 3 separate Roman empires all claiming legitimacy. Emperor Diocletian managed to put things back together around 284, but he realized the empire was too big to govern as one unit, so he split it officially into western and eastern halves, each with its own emperor. The Western Empire kept declining. Rome itself wasn't even the capital anymore. Emperors ruled from Milan, then Ravenna, because they were easier to defend. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire, which would become the Byzantine Empire, stayed strong. Constantinople was thriving. The Eastern economy was booming. Greek culture was flourishing. So when we say Rome fell, we're really only talking about half the empire. The other half kept going for another 1,000 years. Constantinople didn't fall until 1453. That's less than 600 years ago. Keep that in mind. Rome didn't die in 476. Half of it just filed for divorce. So what actually happened in the West when imperial government collapsed? Different things in different places, that's what nobody tells you. There wasn't one single fall of Rome experience. It varied dramatically depending on where you were. Let's start with Italy. When Odoacer deposed the last emperor, life in Italy didn't suddenly transform. The cities didn't burn. The aqueducts kept running. The roads were still there. People still spoke Latin. Roman law was still used. Odoacer and the barbarian leaders who followed him, including Theodoric the Ostrogoth, actually tried really hard to maintain Roman civilization. They saw themselves as continuing the empire, not destroying it. They used Roman administrators, kept Roman laws, minted coins with Roman symbols, and patronized Roman culture. Theodoric's court in Ravenna had Roman senators, Roman philosophers, and Roman engineers. Boethius, one of the most important philosophers of the era, worked for Theodoric. The last great Roman buildings were constructed under barbarian kings, so in Italy the transition was surprisingly smooth, at least at first. Britain was totally different. Britain had been on the edge of the empire anyway. When Rome pulled out the legions around 410 AD to defend the core territories, Britain was basically left to fend for itself. And Britain genuinely did collapse. The Romano-British population couldn't maintain the infrastructure without Roman support. Cities were gradually abandoned. The economy fragmented. Writing nearly disappeared. Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, moved in and took over. Within a few generations, Britain went from a thoroughly Romanized province to what we now call Anglo-Saxon England. The language changed from Latin to Germanic. The culture changed. Even the population genetics changed as new peoples settled. If anywhere experienced a true dark age, it was Britain. Archaeological evidence shows a genuine decline in material culture, population, and complexity for several centuries. Gaul, modern France, was somewhere in between. The Franks took over, but they maintained a lot of Roman infrastructure. Frankish kings styled themselves as successors to Rome. They used Latin for administration. They kept Roman cities functioning. They converted to Roman Christianity, but trade declined. Literacy decreased. The economy became more localized. Long-distance commerce mostly dried up. Cities shrank, but didn't disappear. Spain saw a similar pattern under the Visigoths. North Africa under the Vandals kept some Roman systems but became more isolated. The point is, there was no single collapse experience. It was a patchwork of different outcomes. Now let's talk about what was actually lost, because this is where the myths really take over. We're told that knowledge disappeared, that books were burned, that science and learning vanished, that Europe became ignorant and backwards. Some of that is true, but it's way more complicated. Yes, literacy rates dropped dramatically. In Roman times, literacy might have been 10 to 20% in cities, low by modern standards, but high for the ancient world. After the Western Empire fell, literacy probably dropped to 1 or 2% outside of the clergy. Long-distance trade collapsed. The Mediterranean, which had been a unified trade network, became fragmented and dangerous. Pirates and competing kingdoms made large-scale commerce difficult. Cities shrank massively. Rome itself went from over 1 million people at its peak to maybe 30,000 by 550 AD. That's a 97% population decline. Other cities saw similar drops. Complex infrastructure became impossible to maintain. Aqueducts required constant maintenance and organized labor. When centralized government disappeared, many aqueducts fell into disrepair. Same with roads, public buildings, and sewage systems. Technological knowledge was lost. The recipe for Roman concrete was forgotten. Advanced engineering techniques disappeared. Medical knowledge declined. So yes, there was genuine loss, real decline. Material culture became simpler. Life became more localized and often harder. But here's what didn't happen: total collapse into barbarism. The Catholic Church preserved enormous amounts of knowledge. Monasteries became centers of learning. Monks copied ancient texts by hand. They maintained libraries. They taught reading and writing. They preserved not just Christian texts, but pagan Roman and Greek works too. Without medieval monks, we wouldn't have Virgil, Cicero, Seneca, or countless other ancient authors. They survived because Christian monks thought they were worth preserving, even though they were pagan. The Church also maintained some level of international organization. When secular government fragmented, the Church remained a unified institution spanning multiple kingdoms. Bishops corresponded across Europe. Councils were held. Ideas and knowledge circulated through church networks. Islamic civilization preserved even more. When Arab armies conquered the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain in the 7th and 8th centuries, they inherited huge amounts of Greek and Roman knowledge, and they didn't destroy it. They translated it into Arabic and built on it. Islamic scholars preserved and advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They translated Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Euclid. They added their own discoveries and innovations. Later, when Europeans became interested in ancient Egypt, learning again during the Renaissance, much of it came back to them through Arabic translations. Knowledge that was lost in the West had been preserved in the Islamic world. The Byzantine Empire also kept Roman civilization alive. Constantinople remained the largest, richest, most sophisticated city in Europe for centuries. Byzantine. Scholars preserved Greek texts. Byzantine engineers maintained Roman building techniques. Byzantine merchants kept trade networks alive. When medieval Europeans wanted to learn advanced architecture or engineering, they looked to Byzantium. When they wanted to recover lost Greek texts, Byzantine scholars provided them, so knowledge wasn't destroyed. It was preserved in different places and by different institutions than before, but it survived. Here's what modern historians have realized. The Dark Ages is a terrible term that misrepresents what actually happened. The period from roughly 500 to 1000 AD wasn't dark because people were ignorant or barbaric. It's called dark because we have fewer written sources, making it harder for historians to see clearly into the period. It's dark to us, not dark for them. Recent archaeology has completely changed our understanding. When you dig into the ground instead of just reading texts, you find evidence of continued trade, technological innovation, artistic achievement, and cultural sophistication. The barbarians weren't primitive savages. The Goths, Franks, Lombards, and others had their own sophisticated cultures, their own art, their own legal systems, their own literature. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in England shows Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship that's absolutely stunning. The Book of Kells from Ireland shows artistic achievement that rivals anything from Rome. Frankish metalwork was extraordinary. These peoples weren't destroying civilization. They were creating their own civilizations that blended Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements into something new. What we call the Dark Ages was actually a period of transformation. Roman civilization didn't die. It evolved into medieval civilization. Different, yes. In some ways less complex, but not primitive, not barbaric. And here's something that'll blow your mind. Some things actually got better. Slavery, which was absolutely central to the Roman economy, gradually declined. It didn't disappear entirely, but serfdom, while still exploitative, gave workers more rights and protections than chattel slavery. Women in some barbarian societies had more rights than they did under Roman law. Germanic legal codes sometimes allowed women to own property and participate in legal proceedings in ways Roman law didn't. Agricultural technology improved. The heavy plow, the horse collar, and three-field crop rotation, innovations of the medieval period, actually made farming more productive than Roman methods. Local governance often became more participatory. While no one would call it democratic, medieval institutions like the Frankish assemblies gave more people a voice than the autocratic Roman Empire did. The point isn't that the medieval period was better than Rome. It's that it wasn't simply worse, it was different, with its own achievements and innovations. So why do we have this myth of catastrophic collapse and dark barbarism? Partly because Roman and Byzantine sources, written by people who lost power and status, portrayed it as a disaster. If you were a Roman senator whose wealth and influence disappeared, it was a disaster. For you. But for a peasant farmer, life might not have changed that much. You still farmed. You still paid taxes or tribute to whoever was in charge. Roman emperor or Gothic king, what's the difference from your perspective? Later writers during the Renaissance emphasized the fall of Rome because they were trying to reclaim classical learning and wanted to portray the medieval period as a dark interruption. They created the narrative we still believe. Modern nationalism played a role too. Different European nations claimed different barbarian tribes as ancestors and created origin myths about heroic barbarians overthrowing corrupt Rome. But the reality is messier and less dramatic than any of these stories suggest. Here's the uncomfortable parallel. Could it happen again? Look at our world. We're globally connected. Complex supply chains, specialized knowledge held by small numbers of experts, infrastructure that requires constant maintenance, systems so interconnected that disruption in one area cascades everywhere. Sound familiar? That was Rome too. What happens if our systems break down? How much knowledge exists only in digital form that could be lost if servers crash? How many people know how to maintain critical infrastructure? How quickly could complexity unravel? The fall of Rome teaches us that civilization is more fragile than we think, that complexity creates vulnerability, that institutions can fail, that knowledge can be lost. But it also teaches us that humans are resilient. That knowledge can be preserved by dedicated people even when institutions collapse. That new civilizations can emerge from the ruins of old ones. That decline doesn't mean the end. Rome fell, but human civilization didn't end. It transformed. It adapted. It eventually flourished again in new forms. So what really happened when the Roman Empire collapsed? Not apocalypse. Not a sudden descent into darkness and barbarism. Not the end of civilization. What happened was transformation. Painful, yes. Disruptive, absolutely. But not total destruction. Different regions experienced different outcomes. Some areas declined more than others. Some knowledge was lost, but much was preserved. New cultures emerged that blended Roman and Germanic elements. The Church maintained continuity. Byzantium carried on. Islam preserved and advanced knowledge. It took time, centuries, for new stable systems to emerge. The period was chaotic and often violent. Life became harder in many ways for many people. But it wasn't dark. It wasn't the death of civilization. It was civilization changing form. The Roman Empire fell, but the story of human achievement, innovation, and resilience continued. And maybe that's the real lesson. Empires rise and fall. Institutions come and go, but humanity endures, adapts, and eventually builds something new. The fall of Rome wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of a chapter. If this deep dive into one of history's biggest misconceptions opened your eyes, hit that subscribe button right now. We're tackling the mysteries, the myths, and the moments that changed human history, and revealing the truth behind the stories you thought you knew. New videos every week that will completely change your perspective on the past. Drop a comment. What do you think would happen if modern civilization collapsed? What would survive? What would we lose? I want to hear your thoughts, and I read every single comment. History isn't what they taught you in school. Let's discover the real story together.